Good evening, everybody. It's office hours time again. Sing out on the chat if you can't see me or you can't hear me. Hopefully everything's rigged up like it normally is. I will apologize immediately in advance. I have just the most shocking head cold. So rest assured, these will be coming out at regular intervals during the night. And I'll basically talk as long as I can. And eventually, if the voice gives out before the hour, then we'll call it quits there, but we'll see how we go. But I wasn't going to cancel because, you know, this is favorite time of the month for me. So even though I probably sound like I'm talking in a hollow tube, we'll do our best to get through it. Lots of demos and lots of good things to get through. So let me share my screen and we'll get into it. Can someone just throw something on the chat just to make sure that chat is enabled? Just anything that looks perfect. Yep, chat's enabled. Excellent. Thanks, Judith. Okay, let me share my screen and we'll get into it. Let's go. Once again, sing out if you can't see the screen and the slides. Hopefully you can. It's a bit weird tonight because we have a few demos in multiple windows at the same time, so I can't share just a window. I'm sharing like a portion of the screen, so you'll probably see some borders and stuff, but we'll get through. So let's get going. Oh, I forgot opening slide. Getting in touch is easy. Just go to linktree/Connor or scan the QR code, and that way it's you can get my email, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Mastodon. I was going to say Truth Social. No, I'm nothing on Truth Social. Counter Social is another one. My GitHub repo, YouTube channel, TikTok, blog, you name it. It's Speaker Deck, SlideShare. It's all there. So podcast, etc. So lots of goodies there if you want to get in touch with me. Probably the easiest one is Twitter DM. DMs are always open. Always happy to talk technology. If you're new to office hours, I should say before anything, I think is it Ascension Day in Europe today? So if so, happy Ascension Day, happy holidays. If you are in Europe and you've joined me on a holiday, I'm very, very touched, very much touched. If you've never been on one of my office hours, you'll see the content down, sort of pushed toward the bottom of the slides. That's so when we turn it into a video, my ugly face doesn't cover up any of the important content. So that's just, don't panic if you see it all pushed down to the left. And as I always do at office hours, I like to share a few bits and pieces about what's happening in the community, hopefully to engage you and inspire you to reach out to your own local communities and be an enthusiastic and contributing part of your local and global community. So a couple of things. Last month, I was fortunate enough to be in Norway for the Oracle user group there. And even though this is normally I talk about events that are coming up, I wanted to dwell for a touch on this particular event in the fact that it was one of the first events I've been to where rather than the standard kind of conference they'll do where you'll have all these sessions throughout the day and then they go, oh yeah, at 6 p.m. when everyone's about to go home, that's when we do our networking. I thought, yeah, that's always a shame because many of us say that the real benefit of meetups and conferences is not just the content, it's often just the people you meet and the relationships you make. So in this conference, they did a great thing. What they did was they literally said between 11 and 1 each day of the conference, there's no sessions. That's when you get your coffee break and your lunch, but also you got 2 hours just to mingle. And so you could see like there's a lot of people just sitting around, just chatting. And this was between 11 and 1 every day. So if you're on this call, if you're organizing a meetup of any description or conference or attending one, drop a note to the organizers, or if you are the organizer, try and schedule in some time during the event where you can actually just hang around and talk to people. That's probably the more lasting things you'll get out of any kind of meetup. Yes, most meetups have some fantastic content and hopefully you get a lot out of that as well. But in reality, that the real value comes from the fact that you get the content of people's ideas, people's challenges, and therefore people you can reach out to in the future. Similarly, after that one, the week after that, I went to Apex Connect in Germany. Fantastic event. A couple of pictures I got from there is if you ever get a chance to stay in the Enhau Hotel in Berlin, it's very pink. But yeah, it was very, very interesting. My dog has joined me on the call. Very, very interesting hotel. Sort of a rock and roll theme to the hotel. But yeah, really good event. It's so pink that even the bread at the breadboard is pink. And highlight for me was one of the people there brought along some Apex labeled beer. You've got to be happy with that. If once your computer product has made it into the world of brewing, you've succeeded as a product. And it was nice beer as well. One thing I should say is great to see literally 300 plus people at an event dedicated to Apex. If you're in a company that sort of sometimes dabbles in Apex or sometimes thinks of Apex as just some little bit player on the side of your real applications, that hopefully is proof enough that like Apex is a massive community now worldwide. 300 people plus just at an Apex event just in Germany. Very successful event. Oh, and I forgot one other thing. Another idea for things you can do in your meetups. At this event, they had these things called one-to-ones, where a few people that were speakers, myself included, made themselves available just for a 20-minute chat with anyone. You just sort of put your name down there and you could come along and have a chat for 20 minutes. Some people came along and asked questions. Some people just came along just to say hello. Some people came along just to share a beer. It was great. But once again, a good idea if you're having a meetup, set aside some time for the speaker or speakers at your meetup to basically sit around and have, if they want, a dedicated time slot for people to chat with them. That's often better because sometimes people don't feel comfortable, asking their question in a big room, etc. And this provides that opportunity. So lots of good things there for your own meetups. And one last thing, as proof that it doesn't need a lot of effort to get a meetup going. Between those two events, I went to Denmark for the Danish Oracle user group. Now that sounds like I went for some sort of conference or meetup. I didn't. They literally said, hey, Connor, you're going to be in that side of the world for a couple of weeks. Any chance you could zip over to Copenhagen? And so literally, I think within 7 days of the first email, we had a meetup organized where, big credit to the Danish Oracle user group. And for the life of me, I cannot remember the name of the company that hosted us. My apologies, but Jeanette, thank you very much. But yeah, all you need is basically a venue, a few snacks, someone who's happy to talk, and job done. So once again, and we're doing the same thing here in Perth at the moment. We're trying to get regular meetups going, literally just on a shoestring budget, just because it makes our community more successful. Okay, enough of me pontificating about why meetups are good and ideas for meetups. A couple of things coming up. I'll be in Denver at Kscope. So if you're at Kscope in June, please come along and say hello. You'll get a lot of good details about 23C at that event. I'm doing 2 one-hour sessions, all just focused on 23C content. Coming up, I won't be at this one, is just in May, later on in a couple of weeks' time, the DOAG Databank. If you jump onto Twitter and search for that, there's heaps of great speakers at that event. I'll be in India at the end of July. So if you're an Indian on the call or you're anywhere remotely near India, please come along to the standard OC Yatra tour. We do 6 cities, I think in like about 7 days. So it's torture for us speakers, but it's a fantastic event. We generally get sort of 200 to 300 people at each city. So you're looking at over 1,000 people in total. Fantastic community in India. And so if you're anywhere near India, please come along to that event and say hello. As I always finish this little section of my talk, all of this is about support your local user groups. I know it sounds weird being an Oracle person because I'm not a member of a user group, but I used to be on various committees for user groups. I used to be very active in user groups when I was just an independent consultant, and I cherish and know the value of user groups. So please, wherever you are in the world, please support your local user groups. Let's build that user group momentum because they did it so hard during COVID. Final bit of spruiking. I've just released the final part of my podcast with Maria Colgan, where we spoke about all things tech and also all things non-tech as well. So catch that, as the cliche goes, wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's get into what we're talking about tonight. My throat's just about done and we haven't done any questions yet. So a lot of things to get through. Partial read-only, slow all arguments, idle blockers, a CLOB over a database link, order of predicate evaluation, what is an internal function, in-list elements, and how to find the busiest tables in your system. Let's leap straight into it. First question that came in from a customer, partial read-only. And as the name suggests, here's the question. We have a table where some of the records should be updatable, but others must be read-only. Can you advise on how we can do this? The table is not partitioned. And so rather than talk about methods, I thought we'd just go in and do some demos and explore some methods and the pros and cons of various methods. And we'll do our first demo and we'll see what we can do in terms of controlling which rows in the table can be updated and which ones cannot be. It's important that they said the table is not partitioned. And I thought I'd just briefly show you the declarative way of doing read-only tables if the table is partitioned. And so for this customer, if they had a mechanism where they could actually choose to partition their table into the rows that should be readable and shouldn't be updatable, then that would be an obvious way forward. But let's assume they can't. But just to show you that you have this declarative read-only facility if the table's partitioned, here's a table called T. It's partitioned by list on department number. I've got two partitions, P10 for department 10, P20 for department 20, and it's just all the rows from Scott.emp for those two departments. This is the simple demo. If you want to make a particular partition read-only, I think since maybe 12.2 or 18C, you can now do it declaratively. You can make a table read-only, or you can make a partition of a table read-only. You simply do alter table modify partition, P10 is read-only. Just to prove it, I can still do DML on department 20, but I cannot do DML on department 10. So if it's partitioned, this problem is trivially solved. The question is, what do we do if it's not partitioned? Let's explore some options. So I'll drop my table. Let's recreate it as a copy of Scott.emp, and it's obviously not partitioned anymore. There's my data. I've got departments 20, 30, and 10, and we're going to impose a rule where some departments are updatable and some are not. This is one option you could perhaps consider. Every time you change a row in the Oracle table, we fire the check constraints. And therefore, if we're firing the check constraints, perhaps I could put on a check constraint that would always be false given a certain condition. So in this case, if the department number is 10, then this check constraint will be 1 equals 0, which will always be false. Therefore, the check constraint would be always violated, and therefore the update would be blocked. So let's explore that. Now, the first thing you'll discover, obviously, is you can't put that constraint on because it goes to try read the existing data. It finds a department number of 10. It says, oh, does 1 equal 0? No, I can't even add the constraint. But that's okay. We're looking at all future updates. So I would simply do alter table add constraint check with no validate, which means from this point onwards, if you do an update where department number equals 10, I'm going to fall into this area here. 1 does not equal 0, never will, and therefore the constraint will be violated and you won't be able to do any updates. Let's give it a go. So I update for department number equals 20. That's okay. That's not one of my problem departments, and that's fine. Let's now do for department number 10, and it'll hit that constraint and get an error. And as you can see, it doesn't. So what's going on here? Well, the database is, in this case, too smart for its own good. It sees your update and says, you're not touching or modifying the department number. You're referencing it in the where clause, but you're not making any modification to the department number. Therefore, why would I bother checking that constraint? I don't need to check that constraint. That's just an unnecessary CPU overhead. I can bypass it because you're not touching the department number. That's unfortunate for us in this case because we wanted that constraint to fire in all cases. And we can see that if we actually add the department number in to the update, even though we're just setting it to itself, the database says, you're referencing department number. I need to go actually apply that check constraint, and therefore my check constraint is violated. So already we've seen there's a little bit of a hole in our existing check constraint because we'd have to then insist that we're always referencing the department number, which is unlikely. So let me drop that constraint. Maybe we can hack our constraint to make sure that it's always going to fire. And so I could do something like this. Now, we could do something a little bit more intelligent, but I've just thrown in some random values. Really, all I'm doing is making sure that every single column in the table is referenced. And therefore, whatever I do a set to, I'm always going to have to fire this constraint, even though effectively all these things will never ever be true, which is what I want. I want the constraint to fail when department number equals 10. So I run that through, and now if I try to reference salary or any other column in the table, even if I try to set something to null, that constraint is violated. Now, if the only issue we're worried about here is inserts and updates, then we're good, we're done. This is one way of doing it. But of course, check constraints don't fire when you do a delete because you're simply removing a row. Now, this particular question when it came in didn't specify whether it was insert update and delete or just insert update, but a check constraint is a potential mechanism of looking at this. And I stress potential because we're going to look at some others as well. But as it currently stands, this check constraint option fails for handling deletes. Let's roll that back. Let's drop the constraint now and consider another method, which is probably, I think, probably the one that most people are thinking of, which is let's just whack a trigger on, which is every time someone tries to do an insert or an update or delete at row level, if the department number equals 10 as an insert or the department number equals 10 as an update or a delete, then bang, we'll raise an error. So we'll never get past that trigger. And so we can test it. Update for department number equals 20, that's fine, as we want. Update for department number equals 10, I didn't have to nominate the department number or any other columns. Yep, my trigger fires, we're done, and we get an appropriate error. Similarly, if I tried delete, same thing. Now the trigger has exceeded the functionality that we had with the check constraint. So trigger looks like the way to go. Now, this is a test because we talked about triggers and their ability to control what DMLs are allowed about 4 or 5 office hours ago. So what's that, 4 or 5 months ago? So who's got a photographic memory that can remember what the flaw is if you're using a trigger to control DML in this way? This is a big ask. I know. You're thinking, A, the office hours session had to be interesting enough for me to actually attend. That's unlikely. And you have to remember the particular thing we did. But let's see, we've got a thing in the chat here. There you go. Someone said direct path insert will bypass triggers. Okay, that's close. If I do a direct path insert here, like insert append, etc., it won't bypass the trigger. What happens is the database will opt to not do a direct path load. It'll simply say, you've got triggers, I'll ignore the direct path load and do it conventional. But you're exactly on the right track. If I do a SQL loader direct path load, then the database says, let's just ignore the triggers. So there's a potential flaw in that option as well. Using a trigger, you'd probably argue it's better than the constraint option when it comes to deletes. We don't know if this person was worried about deletes, but there is that possibility that someone could bypass this with a direct load insert. Maybe that's an issue, maybe it's not. But if it's not, then the trigger looks like a good option. Are there any other ways we could do it? Well, there are. Let's see if I lost my... There we go. One way we could look at doing it is using the virtual private database in order to control which rows are updatable. It used to be the case when this was first introduced way back in 8.1, it was simply a tool to secure the querying or the access of data. But since about, I think, 10.2, we changed it such that it could handle all DML. Let's look at this. Now, I have to change this demo slightly because I was running this as myself before, and I'm a DBA, and DBA privileges bypass fine-grained audit control or fine-grained access control. So let's do it as Scott. So my table called T, I'll grant access to it to Scott. I'll create a little package because the way row-level security works is you have a package to control the setting of the predicate. The reason you do that is because then no one can see inside the package body to see what security rules you're applying to make the predicate. So I've got a very simple here function called tPolicy function. It always takes owner and object name. And all I'm doing is returning department number not equals 10. So in effect, that is a predicate that will be applied to every single DML that gets applied. The way we apply that rule is we define a policy. So on my table called T, owned by me, I call that routine for insert, update, and delete. Okay, and it says do it on an update check. It's true, enable it, which now means every time I do insert, update, or delete, I invisibly add that predicate in. So what happens now if I connect to Scott, which has this predicate applied to it? I can do an insert on department 20. That's fine because I wasn't caring about department 20. I can't do an insert on department 10. I get an error saying, yep, department 10. But I still got the trigger on there. I should have dropped the trigger, shouldn't I? Bug in the demo. Hold on a second. Let's see what happens. What do they call the trigger? T read only. Okay. Okay, this is what happens when we mess with the demo in the middle of the demo. Let's see what happens. Okay, so I do a select from for T where M07369. That's department 20, so that employee should be fine. I can update for employee 7369. That's fine, that worked fine. What about employee 7934? Their department number 10, our department that we're trying to control. If I do an update, and here's the difference thing with a row level security policy, I don't get an error, it just wouldn't let me update it. It simply said, nope, no rows were updated. Now, maybe that's the functionality you want, maybe it's not. You have that choice, but it is a subtle difference from the trigger, which actually raises an error. This one simply says, yep, I'm simply going to block that. And if I try to delete, I get an error as well. Unfortunately, my insert you just saw, which had the broken demo, the insert actually would give an error. It says policy function had an error, and therefore you blocked your insert as well. Unfortunately, the trigger was left over. Chat line. Someone said, oh, I meant SQL Loader. Excellent. So let's go back to our slides. So to sum up those, the trigger is often considered probably the most simple of those options and perhaps the most transparent, because the error comes up, it says, yes, a trigger has failed, and it says, here's your error message. You get to control the error message. And so it's probably the easiest way and most visible way. The check constraint, I think, is an interesting way, but it looks a bit cryptic in the definition, and you probably have to have some strong documentation to say why you've got this bizarre looking check constraint. I like that. I like the concept, because what happens there is the trigger doesn't have to fire. So in theory, it should be slightly more efficient. One thing I haven't checked is whether adding a when clause to the trigger would actually make it even better. But effectively, every time you have a trigger on a DML, there's a slight overhead to doing it. That might be an issue for you, it might not be. But the most important thing is, in all these methods, like we did with the direct loader in previous office hours sessions, whatever method you choose, make sure you try test it to destruction. Let me try that again in English. Make sure you try test it to destruction. For the trigger example, you've got to make sure that you're never doing SQL Loader direct load. For the check constraint, you've got to make sure that if someone adds a column, then your check gets updated. There's various things you have to be aware of. Do you always need an error? In that case, the row level security option is probably not the solution for you. Making sure you explore all the options and the consequences of that is important if you're coming to protect data, because one would imagine if you want data to be read-only, there's a very good reason for it. It's super important that it cannot be touched. One thing you could explore, obviously, in later releases is whether that table could be loaded into an immutable table. Now, in that case, what you've there got is a table that nothing can be touched. It's only insert only. That's possibly an option you could explore if it's not just part of the table. Moving on. Oh, Q&A while I drink water. Another option here from Judith, which is you could create two views, make one of them read-only, and then use those two views. That's true. You could actually also make two tables and use a union or view, and instead of triggers to manage it. Lots of possible options there. I'm running on the assumption that they didn't want to carve up that table into multiple tables or multiple options. Certainly a possibility. Whenever you get into views, though, you're generally starting to look at insert instead of triggers as well, which I'm not a huge fan of, because it can have some interesting options when it comes to your DML, or interesting side effects when it comes to your DML. But still, valid point. Let's answer live. Get that done. Oh, excuse me. Whew. If I slump over, so someone call an ambulance. Number 2, all arguments. We dynamically generate instrumentation for all of our PL SQL packages. And I've written something similar myself. It's on my GitHub repo. And yeah, it probes all arguments, which is a database view. But this view is so slow, even for a single procedure. Is this a bug? And probably, oh, did I not? Oh, I didn't put the name of my demo. All args. I'm so predictable. If you go get the DDL for the all arguments view, the first thing you realize is in our multi-tenant architecture, you can't get it from the sys schema if you're in one of the pluggable databases. That's because if you've ever seen in user objects, you'll see various object types now known as, they're called a metadata link, which simply means we have a single definition up in the root container, and that is pushed down to all the pluggables. So the only way to get it is to actually come back as sysdba and then go ahead and get the DDL out of there. And one of the things that happens in a lot of the data dictionary views now is they are views upon views upon views. So if I go look at the definition for all arguments, you'll see it's really just a query from int $dba arguments with some additional checks to make sure you can only see the stuff that you're allowed to see. So if I go get DDL on int $dba arguments, then if we scroll further down, we can see here's the real definition. And you can see it's fairly lengthy with lots of joins and stuff like here. But the key thing is at the top here, which is the object name and the package name are both wrapped with NVLs and decodes. And the reason for that is, if you think about something, let's start again. The reason for that is we have effectively two layers in a hierarchy when it comes to PL/SQL. If you have a procedure, then that is the object, and the arguments for that and the parameters will simply be stored right there. If you have a procedure inside a package, then the object is the package name, but then we have to dive into that to get the individual procedures inside that package. So there's two different layers here, two different levels that all have to be exposed as one view. Hence we have sort of these decodes, like if we have a procedure name, then we use it, otherwise we go back to the object name. If we have a procedure dollar value, then we use it, otherwise we go to the package name. There's sort of this double checking all the time, which means when you query on the object name or package name, you're coming in against predicates that have expressions around them. And we all know that generally if you start using predicates on expressions, then we don't get the index benefits that we would like to see. So let's scroll down further because I forgot my pauses. Here was the first demo I did. I said, I'm going to go look for example, the arguments for dbms lob and the routine called compare inside that routine, inside that package. So here's a typical query that we might run. Go get some various information from all arguments for the package name dbms lob, object name of compare, and any of the arguments. I want all the parameters that go into that particular procedure. What does it give me? 2,833 consistent gets. And this is fundamentally a empty database. I use this database for nothing except office hours and the occasional Ask Tom question. So there's maybe a dozen procedures in here, a dozen packages. If you're running something like eBusiness Suite, 10, 15,000 PL/SQL routines, that number grows up very, very high indeed. And it can be very, very slow. In fact, if you're writing any kind of, let's call it industry strength application, which has a good solid grounding in PL/SQL, that's a good thing, then you'll see this problem that effectively all arguments, because we're coming in on predicates on expressions, can be quite slow. Now, if you do a describe on all arguments, we can see that yes, we've got the owner, the object name, package name, which seem to be the things that we would normally come in on. But another entry that's in here is the object ID. And the object ID doesn't have any expressions or stuff around it. It simply maps into user objects. So one of the options you might want to explore is if you're querying all arguments and you only need stuff from all arguments, still join into the DBA objects or all objects or user objects view to get the object ID. So we go in on the name to user objects, then find the object ID, and then come on the object ID into all arguments, which is what I've got here. So this is the exact same query. I've said, now I'm going to all objects and all arguments. This time I'm coming in on the object ID first, or sorry, the object name first to get the object ID, and then I can use the object ID to dig into all arguments via that path. And you can see even on this tiny database, I've dropped from 2,800 consistent gets down to 159 consistent gets. So if you've got tools or your own routines that are digging into DBA arguments, all arguments, user arguments, and they're running slowly because you have a lot of PL/SQL, which is a great thing, then yeah, look at chucking in a join to user objects, all objects, etc., and you should get a significant performance boost. Apologies there for forgetting my pauses. Yeah, it's been a day of sickness. Idle blockers, I should say. Are there any questions on that one? Hopefully, because yeah, that demo went obviously flying past, but hopefully I scrolled through it at the right kind of rate. Idle blockers. We have a third-party Java app. I like it whenever someone's talking about a problem they have on their own site, it's always the third-party apps. It's never something they wrote themselves, but we'll give this person the benefit of the doubt. We have a third-party Java app that regularly crashes, leaving open transactions in the session. As a result, eventually our connection pool fills up with active but idle sessions, and no one can use the app. What options do we have? Well, we've got three options. The first one is init.io. Did I put there? Yeah, okay. The first one is you can do it system-wide. And there's actually a parameter called max idle blocker time that you can set at system level. You can't set this at session level because it has to apply to everyone because it's cross sessions. And you can set max idle blocker time to a digit. Now, I'm going to set this one going. And even there, we still might. Let's see. I've set my max idle blocker time to 1. We'll come back to that in a second. Create a table or select one from Joule. There we go. There's session number 1. It's deleted a row. It's now idle. It's finished. Let's jump over to session 2. And you can see it's trying to delete from T. Now, here's where I might have to talk at length. Let's flick back to the slides briefly. So I've done alter system set max idle blocker time equals 1. Now, what do you think the units are for that? The units are not seconds, they are minutes. Because this is a broad system-wide thing, think about a database that has, a couple of thousand sessions running on it. That means we have to be regularly scanning all those sessions, any sessions that might have an active transaction, that might be idle, that are idle, that might be blocking something else. So it's quite a aggressive thing to do if you don't know how many sessions could possibly be impacted. So we choose minutes because that is the lowest level of granularity we will allow. If I come back here, you can see it's still going because it's at least a minute before it's going to decide, yep, this person here is causing me problems. I need to blow them away. And in particular, the 1 minute, my understanding, there we go, look, it took 1 minute and 8 seconds before it finally said, yep, this guy had a lock but is now idle. I'm going to wait for up to a minute or slightly longer before I simply say, look, this guy should have committed or rolled back. Therefore, I'm going to kill his session and I'm going to allow this guy to take over. So if I commit here, if I come back to here, what happened to my session? I got smashed. My session got killed after 1 minute. Now, I've run this demo a few times at various times, and I generally see times of 1 minute 10, sometimes 1 minute 30, sometimes even 1 minute 45. So my guess is every minute we're doing a sweep through all the sessions, and we're only then looking at sessions which might be that might be over a minute waiting for a lock, which means I might be waiting for, say, 45 seconds for a lock when the sweep occurs. Oh, you'll still should be wait longer. Then I'll come back a minute later and you might be up to a minute 40, etc. Seems to be better on Unix than it is on Windows. These are Windows machines. Maybe the window frequency is a little bit lower. I don't know the full internals, but I'm just letting you know that if you set max idle blocker to a minute, which is the lowest you can do it at the init.io level, then you're typically going to see between 1 and 1 minute 30, for example, in terms of waiting for that time. But as you can see, it works. It actually killed off a session that left a lock open, but then became idle. In the old days of client server, we call this the going to lunch problem. Someone just went out and went to lunch. So that's option 1. Option 1 is you can do it at system level. It's trivial, you just set it. One of the reasons that people, I think, might not choose this is in something like a connection pool. Generally, you're serving, say, a web application. That's the most common thing. It's a stateless application. You're serving something like Apex or etc. If someone generally sees an hourglass or the little swirly on their web application for more than a few seconds, they hit refresh. And therefore, they've now got 2 people because they simply grab the next one in the connection pool and they're trying to wait. And they keep hitting refresh. It's very easy for those kind of blocked sessions to very quickly cascade because all you need is a few people hitting, yep, let's go again, go again, and suddenly your connection pool has been swamped. Eventually, they'll all clean themselves up because that one person who's idle will be turfed off after a minute. But by that stage, you may have created the same problems anyway. So let's explore what our other options are. The second option is, funnily enough, the exact same facility, but implemented via Resource Manager. Let's look at that. This one's block 2. So this has been around, I think, since probably Oracle 11.2, that same concept of killing someone off if they are an idle but blocking session. And if you've never seen Resource Manager, there's a very lengthy API, very convoluted API, because there's so much stuff you can do with it. But in its simplest form, we create a pending error, which is I'm about to do a whole stack of Resource Manager stuff. I want it to either work or not as a single unit. So I'm going to create a consumer group, which is something that sessions will belong to. I create a plan, which we can bind consumer groups to plans. And we do it here. We say in the plan called stop blockers, for anyone in the consumer group called CG stop blockers, if they are an idle blocker for 10 seconds or more, then we're going to kill them. So in this case, we have, if you're not in the CG stop blockers group, we have this other groups, which is the default. You have to add this to complete the Resource Manager plan. We validate it and we submit it, and it's all done. What this is really doing is setting up a facility where if we attach a user to a certain consumer group, they'll now be bound by this facility. And in Resource Manager, this is units is in seconds, not in minutes. So I'll say Scott is allowed to go into this consumer group, and Scott will start off in this consumer group whenever they connect. So let's now turn on this Resource Manager plan across our database. So we have this plan called Stop Blockers, which consists of consumer group called CG Stop Blockers. And if you're in that, then you are allowed to be idle and blocking for up to 10 seconds. So we connect to Scott, create a table of select star from AMP, delete from that. Let's go over to session 2. 2A. They connect to Scott. They try to do a delete. And hopefully this won't be as long as 1:10. There we go. In this case, it was 4 seconds. So even though we set it to 10 seconds, one would imagine the sweep is now somewhat more regular, and we get, let's just call it close to 10 seconds. So in this case, we got 4 seconds. He can commit, and we come back to here. And the same thing, this person's session has been killed off because they were idle and they were blocking someone. So if you want that more aggressive granularity down to the seconds level, then you can use Resource Manager to achieve the same thing. I'll be honest, I haven't explored too heavily how much system overhead that will introduce, because one would imagine we did the minutes interval for certain reasons. Let me pause and check the QA and the chat. Yeah, so I think I've answered that for Hajul, that yes, it's max idle blocker time is in minutes, correct. In the max idle blocker time in Resource Manager, it's in seconds. Okay, the user is saying there's a difference between a session that crashed due to application problems and one that is holding a block due to bad design or bad user behavior. Yes, that is valid, but I'd argue in both cases, you still want to clean those sessions up. Yes, the cause is different, but I think in both cases, the remediation is we want that guy gone. Does max idle blocker time use the next session that are idle, not blocking the other transaction? No, it does not. So I took a moment to read that question. Yes. So let's say this session here did a delete from T. Unfortunately, this is going to find no rows now, but my session's gone, obviously. If I did a delete from there and walked away from my desk, I can have that transaction as long as I want, as long as it's not causing problems for someone else. It's only when it starts blocking someone that these facilities kick into play. So there's no risk of, if I just go away and delete and say, okay, yep, I'm going to go away and walk away from my desk, that session's not going to get killed unless you are causing problems for someone else. Now, there is another parameter called max idle time, which can be both set either at system level or within a database profile, which is, as you're alluding to there, which is, I don't care what you're doing. If you've just been idle, even if you have no transactions, if you've just been idle for a certain amount of time, we're getting rid of you to reclaim that session. So there is that option as well, but that's unrelated to locking. Hopefully that answers your question. And the third one is a very cool facility, which takes this to another level, which comes in 23C. Let's do a 23C demo now, which shows you a slight variation on this concept of deciding how to arbitrate between locking issues. As you can see, I've got a whole stack of databases running on this poor machine today, so hopefully it doesn't die. So for 23C, let's introduce the concept of, let's introduce the concept of how powerful you are in an organization. So I'll create a couple of users. I've got a user here called Lowly Peasant, and I've got another user called CEO. They're both users on this database. And I'm going to grant to both of them all privileges on the Scott.emp table. So both of them can do delete, insert, update, and delete. So I'll connect as the Lowly Peasant, and they do an update on the Scott.emp table for a particular row. Let's go over to session number 2. Now I connect as the CEO to database 23, and I want to do an operation on that row as well. And by default, as we know, they can't. Even if you're the CEO, you don't get to access a row if someone else has locked it. I did a for update no wait here because I didn't want to do for update because it would just sit forever and we'd be stuck here. I'd have to kill that SQL session off. But you can see that even the CEO doesn't get to lock a row if the Lowly Peasant has got it locked. Let's go back to session 1. In 23C, let's roll back that. In 23C though, we can actually change who has the more important rights to locks. So I'll connect as a DBA, in this case system, and I'll set this parameter. Transaction auto rollback high priority wait target equals 10. Now, before I talk about what that parameter actually does, let's now go through the rest of the demo and it'll become fairly self-evident. I connect as the Lowly Peasant, and by default, but I'll do it explicitly here, everyone who by default connects to the database gets a transaction priority of low. So out of the box, everyone's on an even playing field. They have a transaction priority set to low. I now update that same row. I got the lock and I managed to update that row in the Scott.emp table. If I connect as the CEO, well, the CEO, he has a transaction priority of high. He now has effectively increased rights to take locks over people whose transaction priority is low or medium. They're the 3 levels we offer. So he turns timing on and we try update this row. And you can see he's blocked because the Lowly Peasant has that row locked. But if I wait long enough, he finally got access to it after 10 seconds, which is what that transaction priority target of 10 was. That setting says if a higher transaction priority attempt is blocked by a lower transaction priority attempt, then I'll wait for up to 10 seconds before I take over. And you could argue this is perhaps not the not the fairest mechanism, or it just reestablishes the difference between CEOs and the rest of us in an organization. But it has that facility where you can now have some controls where you say, I don't care what's going on. This particular batch process must finish. It must get access to the table that it needs to overnight. Otherwise, my business fails, etc. So you have this facility in 23C where you can actually now control sort of your level of importance when it comes to your ability to get locks on particular resources in the database. That's available in 23C. As you've seen from these demos here, the timings are generally what I would call a guide, not a rule, because in the background, some process is making regular passes through to see what kind of lock mess is floating around out there. So at the system level, when we set the timeout to minutes, it can be anywhere, in my experience, between 1 to a minute 30 roughly. If you're doing it at Resource Manager, it's generally at or about the Resource Manager timeout you set in seconds. And so far in 23C, my experience has been is those times are pretty accurate. If you set the priority to say 10, then after 10 seconds, a high priority guy takes ownership over a lock compared to a lower or medium priority guy. Okay, someone said 23C for Windows is available for us. No, it's not. The demo you saw there is 23 Windows client talking to a 23C Unix database. In fact, you can see here, there's a bit of my virtual box there, which is running in the background. That's my 23C Linux version. So, but yeah, 23C for Windows will come out when the 23C general availability release comes out, which is targeted sometime in the next 12 months. Whew. One thing I should say to finish that off is, ideally, although the database has these facilities now, I'm generally a fan of make sure your connection pool also has these kind of cleanup settings. Most connection pools have it where they have, if no one uses a particular session within a certain amount of time, then kill it off, etc. Or they have keep alive settings where they'll detect that a session's being killed by the database. It's good for the connection pool to also know what's going on with those sessions on the database. Generally, killing a session under the covers out of a connection pool, ends up can cause more problems than it solves in the database. So make sure your connection pool is sort of, use those settings as well. Q&A. Sorry, yes. Marco said, yeah, what happened to the lowly peasant? I should have gone to that session. Is he still there? If I come back, there you go. Thank you, Marco, for letting me finish off the demo. Yes, he got killed just like the other ones. His session simply got toasted. Correct. Okay, a CLOB over a database link. Many people will know about the problems of this. I'm trying to retrieve a CLOB over a database link, and I get an error. I didn't spell what the error was. Whenever I try to do it, how do I access a CLOB from a remote database? So we'll see what the error is in a second, and let's give it a run. So I'll create a table called T in the Scott scheme that's got C called CLOB, and I'll insert a very interesting CLOB, just 32,000 X's. It says my CLOB. I chose a nice big one because I don't want the database to be the results to be distorted in case I typed a small one and it got treated as a varchar to etc. So I connect to a remote database now, and I'm going to try come back and access this local one. So I'll create a database link called getCLOB. It connects to Scott Tiger on this local database. There I can describe it fine. I can say, go show me the description of this table over the remote database. It says, yep, that's no problems. It's got a column called C. It's a CLOB. But if I try query it, I get, sorry, you cannot use LOB locators selected from remote tables. This is a well-known problem. How do I get access to a CLOB over these tables? This is the easiest way to do it I've found, and it solves all the problems. I simply create a global temporary table on my local instance with a C called a CLOB, because even though you can't do select star from the remote table, you can do insert select star. That's no problems. So I simply insert into my global temp table locally, select star from my remote table. That drags the CLOB into this local global temporary table, and I can now use it. There's my 32,000 characters. Nice and easy, right? Let's commit that off. Now, what's the true problem? Now, I've glossed over something here, and that was the details of the database I was connecting to. The true problem here is nothing to do with CLOBs and nothing to do with database links. The true problem is this. If I go look at that remote database, the one I created the CLOB in, it's a version 11 database. It's an old database. If I look at the database I'm currently on now, which is trying to talk to that version 11 database, it's a 12.1 database. You can see how many databases I'm running on this poor laptop tonight. So this is a genuine problem that existed a decade ago. If I connect to my 21C database, the database I do most of my demos on when we do office hours, here's my 21C database, just to prove I'm not doing any lying here with this. It actually is a genuine 21C database. 19's the same. If I now go try query that database version 11 CLOB, once again with a database link, I get a better error message. It says, you can't do distributed LOBs, are not supported on anything before 12.2, which is what that demo was. It was version 12.1 to version 11, and I had the error. It's an error that used to be there, and you'll still see 1,000 blog posts about it out there saying, oh, yeah, you can't access CLOBs and stuff over database links. That's true back in 11.2 and 12.1. And that error message is the hint that says maybe this is a problem that's been solved. And so let's have a look. Let's now connect to a version 19 database. Yep. Tonight we've got an 11, a 12.1, a 21, and a 19 database, and a 23C VM running on this machine. So if the Zoom session dies, you'll know why. So you can see version 19, create a table with a CLOB in it, put in the same 32,000 characters. Let's go to my 21C database, create a database link back to the version 19 database. So now they're both above 12.2. And guess what? If I do select star from CLOB table at remote database, it just works. Problem solved. So if you are stuck on these old unsupported versions, the workaround is use a global temporary table. You can even use a remote view to extract parts of the CLOBs. But really, there's a much easier solution. Get on a supported version of the database. Once you're on 12.2 or above, this problem ceases to exist. It's a problem that's so well known and people still talk about it today, but the problem's gone. We solved it from 12.2 onwards. All you have to do is be on an upgraded version of the database. So another reason why you should always be upgrading and staying up to date with your database technology. Oh, there's people on the chat line. I've done loads of migrations from 11G to 19C using dev. Yes, this is fixed internally within. That's right. Yep, exactly. Oh, there's a whole stack of quick chats here. Yeah, so Fred, yep, that's correct. Yeah, I'm glad you've done migration to 19C. Thumbs up to Fred. Yes, it's the problem just simply goes away. And thanks, Dave, for your comment, your feedback there. Okay, Aaron said, we are on 19C, both source and target. It still seems happens to us for blob fields. Well, blob fields are a whole different kettle of fish, because what you'll find there is generally, as long as you have matching character sets across all the architecture, I think you'll be okay. I'll need to double check that, but I think you'll be okay. If you have any kind of disparity, then yeah, there's a bit of an issue there, because the way CLOBs are stored, we simply couldn't bring them across. But that's an excellent point. I'll do a bit more research when it comes to binary objects going across, and we'll see how we go. But yeah, let me do some research on that, and we'll see how we go. How are we going for time? Oh, we could probably get this in-list elements. Yeah, popular topic. Let's get this one done. I think we'll get done by 10, and my voice hopefully will hang out by then. Too many pauses for drinks. This is a time-honored problem. Our application generates in-lists based on the results from other tables and sometimes exceeds the 1,000 item limit. Is there any parameter that can be set to increase this? Simple answer, no. There is no parameter that can be done to increase this. It is hard capped at 1,000. And the reason it's hard capped at 1,000 is building arbitrary size in-lists is just a bad idea. Can't stress enough. It's a really bad idea. But let's explore A, why it's a bad idea, and B, what some of the workarounds are that I generally recommend you don't use. So I'm going to create a table here called X. It's an empty table. But just to introduce the concept here, what I'm going to do, I'm going to use, rather than write an SQL that's got thousands of in-lists, because that will be boring, I'll use some PL SQL to generate one. So this is a simple example. I'm starting with an SQL that simply starts with an in-list. And then I simply loop around adding the numbers in the loop, so 2 through 10. So in this example, I'm actually outputting it just to show you what this routine will build. And you can see it actually outputted this SQL. So I simply looped from 1 through 10, built an in-list of size 10, and ran it. The table's empty, so this query is always going to be instantaneous, and therefore it took, 0.003 seconds to run. Keep an eye on those elapsed times, because this table is empty. So there's no query work to be done. It's just simply how long does it take to work out how to run the query. Let's now take it up to 1,000. So the exact same logic, I'm going up to 1,000 now. And you can see it ran fine, 0.05 seconds. Let's now see if we can go above 1,000. And as we've said before, if you go to 1,001, the maximum is 1,000, you get an error. The maximum number of items in the list is 1,000. It's fairly straightforward. And people say, well, if I can query 1,000 in 0.05 seconds, surely you could let us go higher. Well, there are ways of going higher, which I'm hesitant to show, but let's explore what you can do. The maximum number of an elements in a single in list is 1,000. But what you can do is build 1,000, close the bracket, and then do an OR, and then build another 1,000. So it becomes X in 1,000 elements, or X in the next 1,000 elements, etc., etc., etc. So in this case, I'm doing 2,000 elements in total, just in 2 batches of 1000. And as you can see, that actually runs. But notice now it's starting to get a bit expensive to run. As I said, the execution time, the actual time to query the data, is 0 because the table is empty. This is simply how long does it take for the database to work out how to run it, because we're starting to build some very big SQLs now. So another option you can explore, if you're thinking, well, it's going to be too hard for me to walk through 1,000 elements, stop, add an OR condition, walk through next 1,000 elements, add an OR condition in my tool that builds it. Another option you can do is what we call the use of tuples, which is rather than just doing where X is in, I can do where this tuple, X, 0 is in 1, 0, the tuple, 2, 0, 3, 0, 4, 0, etc. In fact, I actually output it here. We're building an SQL that looks a little bit strange because I've got this sort of redundant extra entry in there for each of them. But when you go to tuples, because each one of these is effectively its own little in list, we're not bound by the 1000 limit. So in this case, I can go up to, for example, 2000. No ORs here, just 2000 individual tuples inside that in list. And it works. So if you go to tuples, you can go beyond the 1000 limit. In fact, I'm looping now through several times. I'm going to try 4000 in lists, 8000, 12,000, and 16,000, each time building up tuples. So let's run this. This might take a little while. Come on. It's competing with the 9 other databases running on this poor machine. Okay, so for 4,000 elements, 4,000 tuples in the in list, it took me 0.6 of a second. For 8,000, 2.1 seconds. For 12,000, 4.6, 16,000, 7.3 seconds. And we can be pretty confident none of that was actually query time because the table is empty. This is starting to look at parse time. The database is struggling just to digest a SQL of that enormous size. In fact, you can see I actually had to resort to using CLOBs as opposed to varchar2s because these SQL statements are now larger than 32K. Now, why is the parsing cost high? Why is it so hard to parse something? Surely you simply say, well, if there's one element that's going to do an index read, doesn't matter how many elements, so I just simply grab each element, loop through each one, and do a lookup. Why is it hard to parse a large amount of in-list entries? Well, it's not that simple. For example, let's create a table called T1 with 3 columns. The first thing I'll put 100,000 rows with the values 1 through 100,000. So X and Y have 100,000 distinct values. Now I'll insert the value 0 for column Y. So column Y has 1 row for the value 1, 1 row for the value 2, 1 row for the value 3, and 100,000 rows for the value 0. It's heavily skewed in the word 0. Gather some stats and put an index on, and here's where things get interesting. If I'm querying these elements in the in list, each one of those occurs once. It would be very intelligent to simply do an index read for each one of those, and the database does. It literally does 10 index reads for each of those. But if I added the value 0 in here, then that would be a terrible idea to use the index for the value 0 because it's over half the table anyway. And so the database has a look and correctly does it. But it just goes to show that just because you have an arbitrary number of elements in an in list doesn't mean you can simply assume they're all equal. You have to parse each element on its merits. And that's why the parsing costs get high if you start putting thousands of entries in these in lists. Now, I'm not going to run this. You can see it's all commented out here because I didn't want to subject you to it. I then took it up to 65,000 and 66,000 elements using the tuple system. Now, this is a fake run. I've timed this before. You can see at 65,000, it works, but it took 3 minutes to parse the query and then ran it. 66,000 didn't come out, which suggests there is an actual upper limit even in the tuple situation. And that limit is, as you'd imagine, 65,536. It's the old, power of 2. So no matter what you do, you're capped at 65 or 64K elements in an in list, even if you're using the tuples, etc. And if you go that high, well, don't blame us when it takes 3 minutes to run that query, because that's what it's going to take at least before we even access the data. And just in case you're wondering, if I change it to basically doing, what's this one? 2K and 4K using the OR system, 1,000, then 1,000, then 1,000 using an OR for each one, the times still go up. And if I get that 64, 65K, you get the same results. 2 minutes 13 for 64 chunks of 1,000. And if I try to go to 66,000 chunks, even though they're in batches of 1,000, I still hit that limit. So even if I do it in batches of 1,000 at a time, I'm still at the 64,000 lines cap. Okay, there's more things to talk about, obviously, but let's wrap it up there. It's 10 o'clock. Let me kill off my share. As always, thank you so much for your time, and my apologies for my terrible sounding voice and my constant drinking and blowing my nose. I'll try and get myself healthy for next month's office hours. Thank you very much for those people that participated in the chat and the Q&A. I love it when it's interactive. I've got some research to do on some blobs, and I'll get back to people probably with a blog post on that. But hopefully I'll see you at a conference soon, or a user group meetup soon, or on an office hours session soon. As always, thank you so much for your time. And if you have any questions post this session, hit me up on Twitter with a DM. They're always open. But until then, thank you, and we'll see you next month on Office Hours. Bye for now, everybody.